Welcome to Catch You Outdoors. I'm your host, Captain Rob Mody's. Contact email is catchyoutdoors@gmail.com. Website's catchyoutdoors.com. Facebook page, Catch You Outdoors. Got two books. They're published during what I love to refer to as the COVID years. Bridge to Paradise released this past November, and What I Know About Fishing Southwest Florida released back in November of 2020. Signed copies of Bridge to Paradise are available on my website at catchyoutdoors.com. Both titles can also be purchased on Amazon in both print and Kindle versions. Today's episode is number 25. 25 weeks. Holy moly. Hey, it's a good thing, I guess. The title for today's podcast is The Accidental Sheller. We're going to do a few notes and updates first, and then I'll get into what that's all about. Spring break is in full swing along Florida's coast. Big hubs are Fort Lauderdale, Miami Beach, Daytona, Fort Myers Beach, Clearwater Beach, and of course, Panama City up in the Panhandle. There are smaller places too. There's places all in between that I'm sure have got kids visiting. But those are the big ones, and I happen to live in one of the biggest, Fort Lauderdale. It's crazy. It made the news. It made the national news this morning. So I'm off the beach for a few more weeks, and then things will get back to normal. It's okay. The kids can have it. It's great. They're spending money. Our economy can certainly use it after the last 2 years, so nobody's complaining. Hotel prices in Fort Lauderdale are up 71% for this month. In price. In price. They're full. And they don't allow overcrowding or multiple people sleeping in a room anymore. All that kind of stuff has gone by the wayside. So anyway, but it's a big event. And it's nice to see all the kids back in town. They all seem to be being quite civil. We haven't had any problems yet. So, keep your fingers crossed. But they should be okay. Part 2, gas. Ooh-wee, gas prices. Oh, brother. In the world of outdoor recreation, boating is going to get a lot more expensive. So there's that. I want to explain this to those of you that don't understand. Gas boats and mileage just don't go together. The average, an older engine, a 2-cycle, about 2 miles to the gallon, maybe 2.5 miles to the gallon. A newer 4-cycle engine will get 5 to 6, sometimes a little more. Again, it depends on what it's pushing. It depends on what type of boat it is and how the boat rides, and there's many factors. But nevertheless, I used to have a friend who just called it gallons to miles, because that's pretty much what most boats do, is gallons to miles, not miles to the gallon, especially if you hang 2 or 3 motors on the back of a boat. So automobile fuel, as of this taping, is around $4.50 a gallon right now in Fort Lauderdale. You can certainly understand that fuel to the marina will be at least $1 higher than that, and maybe $1.50 higher. They use non-ethanol. They do a lot of things at marinas to help out boaters, make those motors last longer. Ethanol fuel does not do well in the outboard world, in the boating world, basically. A lot of stories about that. You can read up on it. Has to do with moisture and alcohol. So the reason I brought this up is charter prices are going to make a major jump. And I remember 2008. I was chartering in 2008. I remember when the gas prices jumped up within the same levels. Nowhere near as bad as now, and nowhere near as fast. But they certainly came up. And so we had to add prices on for traveling. Again, back because a boat burns so much fuel. To give you an idea, most 20 to 22 foot bay boats will hold almost 60 gallons of gas. So sometimes that's 3 times what you put in your car. And it takes that much gas to get a boat around, without running out. So it's going to be expensive. I'm not going to kid you. So don't be shocked if you're a charter person and you like going out on charter boats or deep sea fishing or offshore fishing, things like that. Expect to pay more. It's that simple. It's something you just cannot avoid in that business. My expenses were fuel, bait, and ice. And bait was expensive too. If you ran 2 trips a day and you needed live bait, pinfish, shrimp, stuff like that, you're going to add another $40 or $50 to your tag, and then you got to put ice on the boat. One of the whole reasons that Yeti coolers came about, or those style coolers came about, Arctic and those other companies all came about, is because they made coolers that are built like refrigerators. They hold ice a lot longer, and that was a huge savings, which is why you saw Yetis appear on charter boats before anywhere else, before the non-charter type person figured them out. Campers, camping people loved them, especially if you're going out for the weekend. You could load it up with ice and it would stay cold. We found out during hurricanes they're great. I would drag the Yetis off my boat and put them in the garage and load them up with ice before the storm got there, so we'd have ice to use. Whereas the other coolers would just, it would melt off within, I don't know, not even a day. Not certainly not within 24 hours. Within 24 hours. So the Yetis don't do that. Yetis can last 2 or 3 days with ice. So anyway, gas prices, bad news, bummer. So now let's get on to the podcast. Let's get on to the fun stuff. The accidental sheller, where this came about, the title. I'm an accidental sheller, have been for years. I grew up on the beaches of Clearwater, where there's shells. And I took people on shelling trips, chartered shelling trips, when I was boating out of Fort Myers and Fort Myers Beach. I took them over to Sanibel, took them up to North Captiva Island, which was a really great place to drop off and shell. You could also shell on the south tip of Cayo Costa. Legally, you could charter to there. You couldn't go anywhere else because it required a park pass. But long story short, I would get out of the boat with these folks and walk around with them, and you find yourself staring down at the sand. You just do. And you cannot help yourself. You become an accidental sheller, whether you're a shell person or not. You bend down, you pick, oh, that's pretty, and you pick it up. I did it when fishing the beaches and not chartering. When I'd go over to Sanibel and fish for snook in the summertime, especially over by Bowman's Beach and on the northern end of Sanibel Island up toward Captiva Islands. You're fishing and, you're casting, you're concentrating, but you're always looking and like, oh, that's pretty. And you pick it up and you stick it in your pocket. Well, long story short, at the house in Fort Myers, which we moved from 2 years ago, we had jars everywhere. We had containers in the garage that were full of shells. It went on and on. And again, this was not, in my case, it was not intentional. My wife, Jonelle, would shell for specific shells. She would go to look for a certain type because she had, little jars that she liked to fill up with the same ones each and every time. So I call myself the accidental sheller, and that's where it came from. And I've met lots of other people that also fit in this category. Great many of them are captains who take people shelling on a beach. Over here on the East Coast, where shells are thin and not as, it's unbelievable how much difference there is between Fort Lauderdale and Sanibel Island. Fort Lauderdale, if you find 2 or 3 shells in an entire beach morning, so in other words, we will get there at the beach at 7:30, 8 in the morning. We'll stay until lunchtime, noon. So let's just say 4 hours. You might find 2 or 3 keeper shells. So the habit now has been cut back quite a bit. As a matter of fact, all the shells that we have found at the beach in the last 2 years are in a pile on the on the kitchen counter. So there you go. There are terrific shelling places around the world, and we happen to live right next to one. The second best place to shell in the world is Sanibel Island. And I don't doubt that for a minute. I've been to other places. I've been to other beaches. Even other beaches in Florida don't come close to what Sanibel has to offer. Here's the official list. Sanibel is second. Let's see. The number 1 is Shell Beach in Western Australia. Number 2, Sanibel Island. Third, Barricane Beach. Not Barricade, but Barricane Beach in the UK. Agios Dimitrios in Greece. I'm not going to be able to pronounce this one. Albufeira, I believe is how you say it, in Portugal. Koltami in Cambodia. And Gones Beach in Costa Rica. And I'm sure I said that wrong too. So there you are. That's the top rated beaches. But back to what I said initially, Sanibel is number 2, and you live near it if you're here in Florida. Anywhere in Florida, you can get to Sanibel Island. Part of that reason is on Sanibel, rarity comes into play. Sanibel has some of the rarest shells that you can collect on Florida beaches. Number one being the Genonia, which is I don't. That's like, bah, somebody finds a, I found a Genonia. It makes the newspaper. Let's put it that way. Very rare. Over all my shelling trips and all of my time spent taking people shelling and shelling with them and looking at on the beach, I found three: one broken and two whole ones. Um, I think my wife Janelle has found two, maybe three. On my trips, it was very rare. We could do, I don't know, we could do a dozen trips and find one. So it's really unusual. The Janoni, it's a beautiful shell, long spot. It's white spotted with brown spots. I know we're doing a podcast, so you'll have to look it up. It's real pretty. Number two was a lion's paw. That was another one that would get you in the newspaper. Lion paws are also rare, and then the Scotch bonnet was another. I love Scotch bonnets. I think they look really cool. So that's the three tops. We also have Wintle traps, Murexes, and Cowries. So those six shells are something that are fairly unique to the Sanibel area, to the Sanibel beaches. You can find them in other places, but that's where they seem to wind up the most. Um, and not to center so much on Sanibel, when you go down toward Marco Island, there's also excellent shelling down in Marco Island. It's little known because the beach itself of Marco Island, some wash up, but it's nothing like the piles of shell that come onto Sanibel. However, there are shelling trips in the Marco Island area that will take you to the more remote islands just to the south of Marco Island. And these islands gather quite a few interesting shells because of the shoreline. The shoreline has, it's like rocky. It's like rocky ledges. It's coral ledges is what it looks like. And there's mangrove growing right to the edge of the water. So the mangrove roots gather stuff. And I think I wrote, I did. I wrote an article about this. I called it jungle shelling. And that's what it was. I mean, you're marching through mangrove and bending under mangrove and trying not mangroves. That's tough on the body if you're not careful. But this jungle shelling thing is what I like to do in Marco. But you can get a shelling trip there by boat. They'll take you down to those islands and drop you off in there. So check that out. It's another really really good place to find shells. I've been asked about the Fort Lauderdale thing. People are like, why don't shells gather there like they do on the other coast? It's really pretty simple. It's a thing called the loop current in the Gulf of Mexico. That current grabs things from way down south through the southern Caribbean area, Jamaica and down in that area, up through Cuba, and brings it up into the Gulf of Mexico. This current does. Then the current swirls around clockwise around Texas and up Louisiana Panhandle, Alabama, and then cruises around and drops shells in Sanibel. The other thing that Sanibel has really got that's interesting is Sanibel is not a north-south island. Parts of it are, but a great deal of the island, the lower part, is the foot of the boot. It's east-west. So if you look at Sanibel on a map, it's shaped like a boot. That lower boot part, the sole of the boot, faces south. And as that current comes up, it crashes right into the sole of the boot. And so it gathers a lot of shells in that area and a lot of shells on the point where it starts to shift from south to north. That's just the way it is. Over here we have the Gulf Stream, which rips by us, and so the deposit of shells, if there are shells, they're going to be out in the deep water. They're going to be out in several hundred feet to 1,000 feet of water. Not saying they aren't there; they probably are, but we certainly can't get to them that way. Let's talk about rules. There's always rules. There's rules in fishing. Guess what? There's rules in shelling. Recreational seashell collecting is the way Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission calls it. So I'm going to read a little bit of this. Recreational collection of seashells is allowed depending on whether or not the harvested seashell contains a living organism, the type of organism it contains, and where you'll be collecting. Basically, you cannot take a live shell on the west coast of Florida. If it's got a critter living in it, whether it's a crab, a mollusk, whatever, you cannot take it. The only exceptions to the rules are clams and oysters. There's a few other exceptions in certain counties. And remember also there's quantity restrictions. Just like taking a certain amount of fish, you can only take a certain amount of oysters and a certain amount of clams, usually measured in gallons. They do scalloping, of course, up in the northwestern area of Florida, the northwest coast. Um, and scalloping is seasonal. There's strict rules. There are seasons, and so you have to check things before you do scalloping. Also, keep in mind that most shell collecting, live shell collecting, requires a license. So you do have to have a recreational license. It's attached to your fishing license. So keep that in mind. But you're restricted from live shells. Lee County's probably got the most strict rules in which it's just you may not harvest anything live with a live organ except for oysters and clams. Oh, I take that back. You can harvest sunray Venus clams and coquinas, and I'll talk about coquinas here in a second. Let's see. In Manatee County, you may not harvest or possess more than two shells, such as sand dollars and starfish, containing live organisms or any single species except for oysters and clams, sunray Venus, and coquinas. So see, theirs is a little different. And as you travel around Florida, you'll find that every area is a bit different, but you'll find that the live shell rule pretty much holds true for everybody. There are bag limits, there are prohibited species. Everything you can imagine that's very similar to fishing takes place in Florida when it comes to gathering shells. Now let me talk about the coquina. Coquina is a tiny little shell. It's found all over, quite honestly, but mostly most I've ever seen are on the west coast of Florida. Clearwater, Tampa, the Tampa area. Actually, Clearwater Beach, not Tampa. Tampa's inside of a bay, but Clearwater, St. Pete, Sarasota, south to Charlotte County. The Charlotte County beaches, Boca Grande, and then south of there to, of course, Fort Myers, Marco Island. Now, what this is a little tiny shell, twice a fingernail. So if you look at your pointer finger and you can look at your nail about twice that size, that's about as big as they get. Some are much smaller. Multicolored, it's a bivalve, and it lives right at the edge of the water. When the water washes up, the wave comes in. It'll pull a little bit of water and sand out with it, and you'll see these little dudes up on their tips, on their points, trying to dig themselves back in again with their foot. And we not used to. I've collected them recently. They're delicious. I know this sounds crazy, which is why coquina is not on the restricted list for taking. Because if you have the wherewithal to get them, you deserve to be able to eat a few of them. They're tiny, they're quick. We use like seines and stuff like that for them. We would basically dig sand for them and then throw them into a coquina catcher, as we called it, which is a sifter, is all it was, like a colander. Take that out in the water, shake it back and forth, shake the sand through it, and you'd wind up with all these little colorful shells. And coquinas are multicolored. They're really a beautiful little shell. Inside is a clam-like mollusk. As a matter of fact, they resemble a kind of a very small, colorful clam, if you will. Um, the way you fix them, and it's a delicacy on the west coast of Florida. They don't sell it in restaurants anymore. They used to. I was reading a report where they actually used to do this back in the 50s and 60s, and then it just became cost prohibitive. They would charge anywhere from $40 to $50 for a bowl of coquina chowder, which is like nuts. Broth is really what they did more than they almost never made chowder with them. They almost always just used the broth. So anyway, here's the recipe. You can find this online too, by the way. You collect coquinas in a bucket, and it takes about in a bucket. I would say you'd want about like a child's beach bucket that size. That's probably what a half a gallon. That's 2 quarts maybe. You'd want that in coquina shells. So you sift like crazy and you pick like crazy until you get that in a bucket. Once you get them home, you're going to rinse them in fresh water, pour the salt water off. Oh, by the way, leave salt water on them. They stay alive all the way home. Keep them cool. You're going to pour off the salt water, put them in a pot, put fresh water just to cover them, and then bring it to a full boil. When it comes to boil, they will pop. The shells will pop open. And at which time we used to dig the little critters out and eat them. They're very tasty, but let's put it this way: it's you're talking about something that's so small, it's nuts trying to, but they taste good. So Okay, so now you've got a bowl full of broth, is basically what you have after bringing them to a boil. But you got to sift the sand out because they live in sand and it's going to be really crunchy if you don't get that out. So, what we used to do is take a large pot, put a kitchen cup towel over the pot, and use that to seine the sand out. So we would pour, to sift the sand out. So we would pour the broth in over the towel into the next pot, and you need to do that 2 or 3 times to get all the sand out. So the pot, put another pot out, put another towel on it, sift the sand out again, and do it one more time. Then the broth, while warm, is delicious. You put it; it's very buttery. You don't need to add anything to it. I used to sprinkle just a tiny little bit of pepper in it, but oh my goodness, it's really great. If you're real industrious, you can use it as a broth for chowder. You can also use it as a broth to add to your Bloody Marys. A lot of people like Bloody Marys with a little bit of clam juice mixed in. Coquina juice is even better. But collecting it's a problem. No, you can't buy it commercially. No, I cannot find it in a restaurant. I don't think it even exists. As a matter of fact, what I just told you is something that's kind of a lost art. It's gone away. Those of us that grew up in Florida, especially on the West Coast, and did it often, are the only ones that kind of pass this down. And we've certainly done that. I've taught my kids how to make it, so I've done my part. Back to the rules for just a second. There's something that's collected on Florida beaches, like the fascination with this one creature is amazing to me, the sand dollar. The sand dollar is not technically a shell. It's a live animal very similar to a starfish, and I think most listeners know what a sand dollar is. You've probably seen them in every single shell shop in Florida. They're easily found along the west coast, especially in the Clearwater area south, all the way through Sanibel and down to Marco. Depending on storms and tides and things, they'll wash up. They're delicate and they get broken easily, so finding a whole one in perfect shape is a big deal. I want to explain the difference between live and dead sand dollars. I've seen people take live ones thinking that they can take these. You can't. That is considered a live shell, along with starfish. It's not allowed, and it's not allowed over almost all Florida beaches. But anyway, a live one will be a beigey brown color and fuzzy feeling. It feels like it has hair on it. If you handle it, your fingers turn yellow. That's the first sign that it's like, oh, what is this? It's like tobacco stains on the fingertips. That's a live one and should be put back in the water. You'll find them waiting along the Gulf Coast. If you're wading in water just off the beaches and you feel a little hump underneath your foot, you dig with your toe, up will pop a sand dollar. You cannot keep those. You must put them back. When they wash up on the beach and they die, they no longer are fuzzy. Most of them will bleach in the sun quickly. So the ones that you typically find are white in color. And they can be even brightened up even more if you use a tiny little bit of bleach. Now, warning about the bleach sunshine combo. They get brittle. And the more you do that, the more brittle they'll get. So if you're going to keep them, you might want to put a shellac of some sort on them, or at least put them in a place where they're not going to be bounced around much. So there you go. There's a big difference. Please don't take the live ones. Please make sure you put back the live sand dollars. There's a little joke I want to pass along, or a little saying I want to pass along that I heard over and over again about the border between Florida and Georgia was a great place to find shells. Back in the day when live shelling was allowed, especially in the West Coast, people would get live shells, put them in buckets outside their hotel rooms or whatever, their cottages, their house. And then they'd head home to the north. They'd drive north and they'd put the shells in the back. And guess what? They'd start to bake in the sun in the trunk and they'd get to stinking. And guess where they throw them out? That's right, at the border of Georgia and Florida. So there was an inside joke among Floridians years ago that the best place to find shells is along the border of Florida and Georgia. So there you go. If you've heard that, now you know why. If you have a knack for art, you might want to give it a try. Shell art. It's very, very popular. As a matter of fact, there are all kinds of events up and down Florida's coast for shells, how to find them, where to get them, stuff like that. But more importantly, creations of shells. Every shop I've ever been in, small gift shop in on the west coast of Florida, around Sanibel, Fort Myers Beach, places like that, Marco, will have some sort of art creation done out of shells. If you're good at that, You might be able to make yourself a little second income. So keep that one in mind. If you are a serious sheller, if you want to be a serious sheller, if you really want to get into collecting the rarities of the lion's paw and the Genonias and that kind of stuff, you're going to have to be quick, early, very early. There's a thing in Sanibel called the Sanibel Stoop. The Sanibel Stoop is where people are bent over at the waist looking for shells. The stoop also takes place in the shallow water at the edge of the beach. There's a clue for you. It also takes place early in the morning. You'll see, because I'm an early morning fisherman and like to fish the beach for snook, it was not unusual to run into a sheller early in the morning in the dark with a headlamp on, looking for shells along the beach or in the. I mean, that's a common sight, to be perfectly honest with you, especially this time of year in the wintertime when all of our guests are here. So, early bird gets the shell, no doubt about it. That's doesn't not always true in the world of fishing, because we know the tides play more of a part than the early morning. But early morning doesn't hurt. I'm certainly not going to say don't do it. So in the world of shelling, very, very early does. Also, tides do make a difference in shelling, but not so much to movement and feeding like it does in fish. The low tides are really great for hunting for shells because the best shells are still in the water. And when you've got a good low tide, you can wade out onto that exposed sandbar that's just off the beach and look on the far side and near side, or in the gully that's created between the sandbar and the actual beach. That wash of water gets shallow. And you'll see a lot of shellers. They really key on low tide, so keep that in mind. Storms. Storms are wonderful if you're a sheller. You wish for a good tropical blow coming off the Gulf of Mexico. Not hurricanes. Nobody wishes for a hurricane. But the tropical storms that blow up into the Gulf and create waves and wind of 25, 30 miles an hour, when that storm is over with, believe me, the beaches from North Captiva, Captiva Island, Cayo Costa south through Sanibel are going to be covered in a whole new fresh crop of shelling at those beaches. So, you know, plan accordingly. As a charter captain, it was known that I did shell trips. I had several, more than several. I had dozens of clients that would call me when the storms were coming and book after storm trips. They knew what it was going to be like. The best shelling I have ever experienced was with my wife Jonelle after 2004's Hurricane Charlie. When Hurricane Charlie came through, it was brutal. Cat 4, possible 5 for all we know, came up from the Gulf of Mexico, turned right and tore through Captiva, North Captiva, Sanibel, up through Boca Grande Pass and on into Charlotte Harbor, and it was horrible. It actually cut an opening in North Captiva Island. It cut a swath right through the middle of it that the Gulf of Mexico came through. When that happened, thousands of long ago buried shells became exposed. It blew so hard, it blew the sand out so hard that all these shells that have been buried for who knows how long, decades, showed up. And Janelle and I went up there in the boat, put it on this little cut, and started walking through there, and we just could not believe what we were seeing. We still have the jar on our dining room table. It's got, we call it the hurricane jar, the Hurricane Charlie jar, if you will, but it's got some of the most spectacular shells, and we found all of those within about an hour, maybe an hour and a half. So storms are cool, and storms will certainly help. A big blow will help you find some really great shells. So if you're a visitor to the area on the West Coast, or if you're a snowbird and you're coming down for the winter, keep in mind, even though some days, there's those days you don't want to be at the beach, they're a great day to go shelling. Tools of the trade. We'll finish up with this. Sunglasses, really good polarized sunglasses for shelling. As much of an advantage as it is for fishing. When I say good, I mean the expensive ones, not the cheap ones. Get yourself a pair of Costas, Smith Optics, Breakline, Maui Jims. All those companies make really high quality polarized sunglasses. I would recommend for the West Coast, for hunting for shells, you want either an amber or a green lens that helps cut through the color of the Gulf water. Ambers are by far and away, in my opinion, the best for cutting out all glare and seeing shells that you would never see before. Plus, amber does something interesting. Amber enhances reddish tones, which the Genonia has got a brown dot on it, and it enhances those dots to where it becomes more visible when you're looking for that very special shell. Same thing with the lion's paw. The lion's paw has got kind of a reddish hue to it, so they pop. You'll actually see them more than you would with a naked eye or a regular pair of sunglasses. If you're hunting on the West Coast for shells in water, which people do, blue lenses work. You want to switch to blue. You don't really want to do the amber ones over here on this coast. Headlamps, I mentioned that before for night shelling. They're an amazing batch of new LED lamps for your head now, which are fantastic. They're rechargeable. I saw them mess up at Bass Pro for fishermen. We can stick them on our hats or stick them on your head, especially early morning when you're rigging your kayak to go fishing. That's what I use, is one of those little headlamps. It's really great. So those will work quite well too. Sand nets, or scrapers, if you will. Basically these are tools that you use to scrape up the sand on the edge, sift it in the water, as I was explaining with coquinas. And that, as the sand falls through, you may get lucky. And I've watched a lot of people work those, especially in the daylight hours. If someone doesn't want to really hit the beach early in the dark, doesn't want to do the headlamp thing, doesn't want to hunt in the water, just would rather just, lay in bed and go at 10. I get that. I understand. I'm retired now. You can use these diggers that will dig in, and they're basically like a colander on the end of a handle. That's the easiest way to explain them. And of course, long-handled nets are great too, because you'll occasionally in the surf you'll see a shell wash up and wash out and you're trying to nail it with your hand. That's really hard. It's great if you have a little net in your hand, a long-handled little kind of like a bait net, and slap that down in the water and catch that shell as it's rolling away. Well, that's all I got. That's it, y'all. Another week has passed. Don't worry. I'm already thinking up one for next week. But I'm not going to spill the beans yet. We'll have another one here soon. Thank you so much for listening. I appreciate you taking the time to tune in. If you enjoyed the podcast, would you please tell a friend and share it on social media? I'm building those numbers, folks. Share it for me. I appreciate it if you do. Catch You Outdoors is hosted by Anchor and available via Spotify and Apple Podcast. Our Facebook page is Catch You Outdoors. Website is catchyououtdoors.com. Until next time, get outdoors and enjoy.